Hi everyone, this is Suveda from Zephyr Lake Carmelite Mission. This is the second video on the Lake Carmelite formation, and today we will discuss an introduction to Carmelite history. How did the Carmelite order come into existence, and how did the third order come into existence, and when all that took place? So we have two kinds of information on the history of Carmel. One is written recorded history, and the other one is actually based on a collection of books written in the 14th century by a Carmelite provincial, Philip Ribot. He told the story of Carmel's beginnings in a mythical way, having Mary and Elijah as our role models. He talked about in the traditions how Carmel came into being all the way from the Old Testament, when Elijah he defeated the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and his collection of books kind of share with us that the monks or the hermits of Carmel have continued to live all the way from the time of Elijah, and they were among the first Christians, first people to accept Christ. And they had a great devotion to our Blessed Mother as well. So there is that tradition. But today what I'm going to be reviewing is the recorded history in the church of the Carmelite order. So the recorded history actually begins somewhere in 1150 AD, when some of the laymen who were associated with the Crusades in Holy Land gave up that secular way of life, and they wanted to live a eremitical way of life in solitude and silence on Mount Carmel. So they settled in Mount Carmel, and there they were led by Berthold. That was the first, you can say, the first leader for the hermits on Mount Carmel. And Berthold was succeeded by Brocard, and they were called as the Brothers of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And also today we are called that, the friars are called that, and our order itself is called the Carmelite Order of the Ancient Observance. And there were laymen associated with this holy, the Crusades, that were the first friars in the late 12th century. Then in 1206 to 1214 AD, they were already leading a very austere life and a life of solitude, silence, and prayer, but they didn't have a formal recognition from the church as a religious order. So they went to the Patriarch Albert of Jerusalem, and he wrote a rule for these hermits. He basically documented what they were already living. And this rule is very Christocentric and very rooted in the scripture. And it documents that the friars or the Carmelites at that time, their life involved the meditation of the law of the Lord day and night. And also they were in reception, they received a Holy Eucharist daily. They had Mass daily and received Holy Eucharist daily, which was very uncommon in those days. And they lived in individual cells, like huts kind of thing, and they lived alone in solitude. But they built a chapel in the middle of their cells. And this particular chapel, the original Carmelite hermits dedicated that chapel to our Blessed Mother, Mary, the Mother of God. So they were then called as the Brothers of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. So that's how our name came to be called as Our Lady of Mount Carmel, Carmelites. That's how we are called as Brothers of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. That is the first order, the friars. Then in 1238, as part of the Crusades, there was a great conflict between Christians and Muslims, and the monks and the hermits of Mount Carmel, they had to flee from there, and they went to Europe, and slowly they had to adapt because they were no longer in a hermit setting, so they became more like the Franciscans and Dominicans. So they began to go to universities and to study and to teach and all those things. So that began around like 1238, and probably 1247 is when Pope Innocent IV, he adapted, or he mitigated the rule of Saint Albert to fit the mendicant orders in Europe at that time, like Franciscans and Dominicans. There's always been this struggle within the Carmelites, all the way from then and even today, to maintain the contemplation and this eremitical way of life versus a more active kind of way of life. So there's always this tug of war, that struggle that is in the hearts of most Carmelites, I would say, to maintain contemplation as their primary focus. And the first general chapter of the Carmelite order was in Aylesford, Kent in England. That's where they had the first general chapter. And the first prior general most likely was Saint Simon Stark. And we know that for Carmelites, of present time, we try to balance between prayer and action. Just like Prophet Elijah and Mary. Mary was a woman of prayer, but she also was a woman of action. And so was Elijah. He was a prophet who was contemplative as well as an action-oriented prophet. So that's what we're trying to live out. But our focus, as we said in the first video, that yesterday's video, is for prayer, to discover God within ourselves and to live in the presence of God day and night, and to meditate on the scriptures. And so that is our primary focus. In 1270, our prior general Nicholas, he was a called Nicholas the Frenchman. He actually argued to go back to the original rule, which was to live a more eremitical life in a rural hermitage kind of a setting. And then in 14th century, that's when we have the provincial Philip Ribot, who tells the story of Carmel in a mythical way with the Marian and Elijah traditions. And he writes this book, or a collection of books, called the Institution of First Monks. And that after the rule of Saint Albert, that is a collection of books that is the most important for Carmelites. And further with the Carmelites, in the 1452, we had a prior general by the name Blessed John Soreth. So until then, only men were Carmelites. Until 1452, only men were Carmelites. But in 1452, under the papal bull Cum Nulla, the women were associated with the order. And so we had the nuns, and that was brought about under the authority of prior general Blessed Soreth, John Soreth. And then in early 15th century, there was and also along with that, the lay people also were affiliated in that 1452 time frame when the women were affiliated with the order. We also had the third order form in and around that time frame. Also, within the history of Carmel, there are several reforms that happened. The most important reform that we all have, or most popular reform that we all know about, is the Teresian reform brought about by Saint Teresa of Avila in the 16th century in Spain. And her objective was try to bring the order back to live out the what she thought at that time to be the primitive rule of Carmel, even though it was a Carmel rule from 1247. but it was a rule that was not mitigated, the unmitigated version of rule of Saint Albert. And Saint John of the Cross also joined her, and together with Saint John of the Cross, they brought about several changes and reforms in the 16th century. So as an example, Saint Teresa didn't allow more than 13 women in each community, and she encouraged them to develop a deeper relationship with God. And also she said that the smaller the size of the community, the relationship will be more loving with one another. And she wanted that, each Carmelite to understand that they are solitaries in community. So she again stressed the importance of silence and solitude. And it was only after the death of Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross that the Carmelite order actually split into the Discalced Carmelite and the Ancient Observance. So the order that I belong to is the Ancient Observance. It's called the O-Carm. The order that there are other people who belong to this is called the Discalced Carmelites, or OCD. So they followed the reformed Saint Teresa's reformed way of life, but it split only after Saint Teresa's time, not during her time. Even before the Teresian reform, there was a reform of Mantua. The reform of Mantua was brought about by, actually, I believe, Blessed Soret, and the stress was on silence, solitude, and restricting access to the monastery by outsiders, because a lot of the time, if we are constantly interacting with the outside world, we cannot live out our silence and solitude and reach the deeper state of contemplation. Also, he limited the term of office for positions of leadership, and also because they were friars at that time, they would not have any personal property, but community would own the property, and community would have the resources, like finance was distributed from a common fund, those kind of things. Obviously, as lay people, we cannot do that. We have families and we have other commitments, so this was more for the friars. Also, the rules or the reform of Mantua removed the inclusion of meat from the diet, so they went back to being vegetarians. And we'll see more about the rule in our next video. And there were some other reforms, like the reform of Touraine and other reforms that the main objective of most of these reforms were to bring a stricter observance of the rule, and also to encourage the practice of contemplation and the love of solitude and the love of silence. So the North American Carmelites, the orders started in the 1800s. So there were two essential provinces. The province of St. Elias, which is the one I belong to, was started by Irish Carmelite friars in New York in 1889. And then the province of the Most Pure Heart of Mary was started by German Carmelite friars in Kansas in 1864. And by, between these two provinces, the largest concentration of the lay Carmelites in the world is actually within North America. So that's something that we can be, aware of, I guess. And more on this, the importance of Elijah in our event, in our historical formation of our Carmelite orders. We'll cover all that in subsequent videos, but it's important to note that there's a mythical traditional story that helps us devotionally to trace us all the way back to Elijah in the Book of Kings. And then there is this recorded history which begins more like in the 12th century. So it's, but we know that the original Carmelites had settled on Mount Carmel by a spring known as the Fountain of Elijah. So that's the history of how Carmelite order formed, and the ancient observance is called O Carm. And we have the first order, which is the men, the friars, and then the second order, which is the cloistered nuns, and then the third order, which is the lay community. And the lay community has a modified set of rules, and we will see that in our next video. Thank you for watching and have a blessed weekend.